So today I'm going to talk about wiring minimization applied to deep neural network and using it as a way to try to uncover the topographic organization of such networks. So this is a joint work which I did with Talia Kunkel, who is at Harvard Psychology Department in the Vision Sciences Laboratory. So let me start telling you a little bit about the topographic organization in the visual cortex for those of you who actually don't work in the visual, in vision or in the visual cortex. So you know that neurons in the visual cortex respond to visual stimuli. And the visual cortex has a very consistent topographic organization where if you take two neurons in the visual cortex and you look at their receptive fields, you will find that they actually are located close by as well. So close by or nearby neurons in the brain will have nearby receptive field. And they will actually map the whole visual field. And each repetition will correspond to a different visual area. So this is what I'm showing here. This is an inflated human brain. And you can see this is a visual stimulus. This semi-hemisphere represents a visual stimulus. So what they will do, they will either put stimuli in the form of wedges. And at each location of the wedge, that will be like, it will correspond to basically a polar angle location. They will look at which neurons in the brain, responded. And then they will say, okay, they will give them the color, like associated with the color they give to that location. So they say, okay, the neuron here in green will respond when the visual stimulus is put in the green region. Neurons in this dark blue responded when the wedge became in the dark blue region, and so on and so forth. So this is the polar angle. Also, they can do another mapping where they actually put kind of like rings of stimuli, and then they will expand them. And at every radius, they will also, again, look at which neuron responded at that location. And that will be, they call it the eccentricity. So you can see, as I mentioned before, that this map, like if you look at the polar angle, you will have, like you go from the green all the way to yellow, and you'll have one map going from all the way from green to yellow, and this will be V1. Then you see there is another repetition on the map, which is basically V2. It also represents the whole visual field, but it wraps around V1. And then you have a different area, which is V3, again, wraps around V2. And what you're seeing here is actually, if I have a horizontal meridian and a vertical meridian, you're having, this is the horizontal meridian that divides the visual field into an upper visual field and a lower visual field. So this is a nice topographic organization of the visual cortex. The underlying mechanism behind such organization is not very well understood. However, we know that there is a hypothesis that has been successful in explaining organization at different levels of the nervous system, which is basically the wire minimization or the wire length minimization hypothesis. And it says, well, you have neurons, your neurons process and transfer information. They have to connect to each other through the axons and dendrites, but forming these connections can be can require a lot of resources. And we have limited resources. Also, neural processing is metabolically expensive, and larger connections are associated basically with larger metabolic costs. So these are arguments people argue why the brain actually can be doing this wire minimization. And there is a lot of interesting work that have been done throughout the years that can show how this wire minimization hypothesis can explain organization in different brain areas and in different species, actually, like Drosophila or C. elegans. So what I'm going to try to ask is that, okay, let's assume that we have this wire length or wire length minimization hypothesis is the right hypothesis that can uncover topography. And we can basically ask, can this visuotopic organization emerge if we do a total wire minimization of neurons connected in a deep hierarchical network? In particular, let me explain more what I mean by that. What I mean by that is that suppose you have a hierarchical network and that has n units, and I take this n units and I want to throw them on a two-dimensional grid. Here, I just picked the grid to be looking like the brain. So I can ask, well, if I want to place them on the grid in such a way that the overall or the total distance or the total wire between them is minimum, what kind of organization this produces, right? So I'm thinking of a network, I'm thinking of its connections, and then I'm thinking of taking those networks with those particular connections, throwing it on the grid, and then trying to look at what organization emerges if I minimize the total length between the connected neurons on the grid. So you have n neurons, I have n units because I want to see a map. So this is how I'm gonna build the network. So there's so many ways to build networks, but I'm gonna choose an architect which has been used a lot in basically trying to understand vision, which is the convnet. So this is kind of a simple convnet where I have layers, two-dimensional layers. So you can see each layer. In each layer, I have a filter. And what happens is that every time I place the filter, this means that the units in this layer are connected to the unit on the top layer. And then I will slide the filter, and then I have another set of units, and then they will be connected to the next unit in the layer above, and so on. So basically what you do is that, and because you're forming the network in this way, you can actually predict what will be the size of your next layer from your previous layer. If you know the size or the length of the previous layer in one dimension, you know your filter, you know something called the stride, which basically tells you how much you slide the filter as you're moving it, you know, in the layer. So knowing the filter, the stride, the dimensions of the first layer, you can compute the sizes, you know, of the layers above and so on. So again, this is the formula. If people know ConvNet, this is the formula that you see in convolution neural network, except that we don't have paddings, the zero padding. And what I'm gonna do extra is that I'm gonna allow to have, you know, lateral connection if I wanted to. And I'm gonna basically allow to have different lateral connections in different areas, different lateral connection lengths in different areas. So in particular, picking particular values of your parameter will give you a particular network, right? Every time I pick a filter size, the length of my initial layer, the stride, the horizontal connections in every layer, I have a network now. Now for every network, you can define a connection matrix. And the connection matrix is defined as follows. It's a simple, you know, adjacency matrix. It says, take two units, I and j, put 1 if I is connected to j, and 0 if they're not connected. It's very simple. So every unit, every network now has an associated connection matrix A. So I think of a network now as a matrix A. And I say, okay, then for this network, I know it's adjacency matrix. If I take all the units in this network and I throw them on the grid, then I can write a cost, some cost function, which says for a particular arrangement or configuration S, I'm going to define it to be the sum over all units ij of aij, basically count it if it has connection, don't count it if it doesn't have connection, and the distance dij, which is their distance on the grid. So it's a very simple cost function, right? You have a distance measure and then you say, okay, contribute, doesn't contribute. And this looks like a nice trivial problem to solve, but if you have only 50 units, you can have like 10 to the 64 possible arrangements. So it's a huge combinatorics problem that we're trying to solve. So coming maybe from a physics background, and people who know physics, we know that we like simulated annealing. We use it in physics. I'm going to say, okay, this is a problem where I can actually solve using simulated annealing. There is other ways you can solve it with other algorithms. I chose simulated annealing. And for you who like haven't used this algorithm before or don't know what it does, I can explain it like, in a very simple way or like a very basic way. So we're going to start. So what I'm trying to plot here, as much as my artistic ability, lets me, is the cost function. That's some hypothetical cost function I'm plotting. And you say, okay, I'm going to start with the units randomly arranged on the grid. That will give me a particular cost. This is what I'm like cartoonish wise plotting it as the red dot. Then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to start from some initial temperature T, greater some T min that I actually defined. And then I'm going to start performing the following operation. We're going to pick a state or very close to my state, either by swapping 2 units or a bunch of units together. And then I'm going to compute the energy of that state. And I'm going to say, well, if the energy difference is negative, it means my new state has a lower cost than my previous state or my initial state. I'm going to accept it. That's it. I guess I got a state with a lower cost. But if it actually has a higher cost, then I'm going to still accept it, but now with a certain probability. And that probability is proportional to the negative of your cost difference divided by that temperature parameter. And then after you looping out times, you're going to reduce the temperature and repeat. So basically by reducing the temperature, you're accepting less and less states that has higher cost function. So this is how we're going to solve the problem. As I said, like very simple using this methods of annealing. So we're going to start seeing what do we get. So we ask ourselves, okay, what happens when we consider just a purely feed-forward hierarchical network, right? Like something similar to ConvNet. What will happen? So this is an example where we have a 4-layer network. The network has 630 total units. Again, think of like the 50 units example that I gave you before, how many states it have. This has 630 total units. The sizes I put, just to give you an idea. So the first layer is a 14 by 14. It has a filter 2 by 2, stride of 1. And so I can determine the other layer, the sizes of the other layer, which in this case are going to be 13 by 13, 12 by 12, and 11 by 11. And then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to toss those units on the grid, and I'm going to, perform my optimization. And what do I have? So here, what I'm showing you is actually the units colored according to their layer. So the red units are the units which form the first layer. The yellow units are the units which form the second layer, and so on. So we don't see a huge organization by layer, especially for the top layers. And then I can ask myself, well, how will the receptive field organization look like, right? Because I'm interested in basically in topography, in the retinotopy that such networks produce. Well, for this, I'm going to do something. I'm going to introduce an input layer, right? Because I have to have some form of an input. And that input layer, I'm going to connect it to the first layer with this filter, the same size as I use in my network. And then I know the connectivity, right? Once I know the connectivity, I can take each unit in the network and I can trace back all the way which units in the input layer it's connected to. And I can define a receptive field location for that unit to be the center of those units in the input layer, okay? And then I'm gonna take this input layer, I'm gonna assume there's a horizontal meridian, there's a vertical meridian, and I'm gonna, basically color the units in this layer according either to their polar angle or eccentricity. So this is just like a mock diagram that shows like I take this input layer and I can now color or each unit according to its location and eccentricity. And when I do that, what do I see? I see that actually my network, the network that you previously saw, now its topographic organization forms a nice smooth map of the visual field. So you can see you're going all the way from green to yellow, right? And you have the periphery to foveal. So you have this nice organization that we saw in the brain before, but it's one visuotopic map, right? We're seeing only one map. What it means here is that the units all the units in all the layers actually like contributed visuotopically to being one area, one visual area. So this is, I'm just trying to show you to compare. So you can see that I have yellow all the way to green. So this can be, for example, on layer V1, right? You can form only one visual area. So all of these units in all the layers from the topographic point of view is V1. That's it. We haven't got to any higher visual areas yet. So, sorry, go back. Oops. So, okay, are these really depending on the filter size? So I'm going to keep the network, the first layer, the stride, and I'm going to just change the filter size. Of course, when I change the filter size, now I have layers with different units, number of units. But changing the filter size, again, I can see that how the units are organized according to the layer they belong to. And when I look at the Visuotopic organization, I can see that I still have only a single map, right? So the filter size did not give me, changing the filter size didn't give me like more, visual maps. I'm still having one visual area, one map, one smooth map. Then we said, okay, maybe we can change the number of layers, the depth of the network. So we took like an 8-layer network. Now this network has 1,136 units. So you can think about combinatorically how hard it is. And what we did is that, again, we looked at the units colored according to the layer. Again, at the top levels, we don't see a strong organization by layer. But when I looked at the Visuotopic organization, again, I'm seeing a single map, but it looks to me as like it's one single visual area. So it didn't save me. And maybe here I can give you an intuition of why we'd expect to see something like this. Why is it like not surprising? If we actually think about it like a little bit, it maybe appears trivial, but I'm gonna try my best. We know that units that are connected together will be placed together in order to lower the cost, right? That's how we wrote the cost function. In feedforward network, units that are connected in different layers have nearby receptive fields, right? This is by construction. And therefore, to lower the cost, they're going to be placed together on the grid. There's another thing that we have actually to pay attention to is that even if we take 2 units in the same layer, even though they're not directly connected to each other, they actually can be connected to a same unit. So what I call it, they share the connection. So units can share connections. And I can quantify by how much 2 units share connection actually by computing something called the Jacquard index, which is some measure of similarity. So I see if I have 2 units, U and V, and I define capital U to be the set of all the units that unit U is connected to, and capital V to be the set of all units that unit V is connected to, then I can compute the Jacquard index as the intersection of these 2 sets divided by their union. So you will have 0 if they just don't share any connections, and 1 if they're exactly the same one. So the larger that index, the more quote unquote similar the units are. And therefore they should be placed, or they will be placed closer together on the grid. And here what I'm showing you is just like 2 units. This is just to illustrate what's happening maybe in a visual way, is that I have 2 units. I'm picking in each network 1 unit, or from each network 1 unit, and I'm displaying its first connections, or the connection which are 1 edge or 1 link away, as the light yellow. So this shows you that how the units which are directly connected to it are actually being put close together as we expected. But I'm also showing you the units which are 2 edges away, right? And these are the units that are not directly connected, but share units with that network. And that's I'm showing them here in green, and I did my best in order to actually change, make this a bit, at least how can I say, like understandable by trying to have the green color darkness corresponding to the similarity or the Jacquard index. So the darker green will have higher similarity or Jacquard index than the lighter green. So all of them are 2 links away. All of them are in green, but then how dark the green color is tell you how similar they are or how higher this overlap that they have. So you can see the higher the overlap, the closer they will be to the unit. So this can tell me, okay, then this seems to be like sharing units is a nice way in like kind of like stitching the map together and having it be like it, or give me a smooth map. So can I break this smoothness, right? And well, let's see what should I do, what will happen, or if my intuition is right, let me try to kill the overlaps, right? So I build a unit, a network with no overlap at all. So this is a network. It's an extreme, as I said, extreme case. It's a filter size 2 by 2 strike 2, right? So you have a filter size 2 by 2, and you're jumping like, you know, like 2 units every time. So each 2 units in the top layer, now they don't share connection in the lower layer, and so on and so forth. So if you do like this, you look at the organization by layer, and here, of course, the first layer will have the, you know, the most units, because in this process, you're halving the number of units as you go up. And now let's look at what Visuotopic organization can I actually have. And you see that as our intuition is correct, or like points out, you lose the smoothness of the map. So you don't have the Visuotopy anymore. So this basically takes me to my first key result. I think that is interesting is that from those the numerical experiments that we saw and those intuition that we tried to build is that purely feed-forward hierarchical network form one Visuotopic map only. And in the case where you have non-overlapping filters or, you know, connection among units, then you might not have any Visuotopic map. There's no Visuotopic map emerging. So we can think of like, okay, so how do we get multiple areas? So we say, okay, we know the brain has lateral connection. That's why we allowed them to take place in our units. So we say, okay, let's try to add lateral connections now. And let's try to allow it, the extent of those lateral connections, to vary by layer, okay? And now let's see what happens. Well, let's take an extreme case where I have long horizontal connection, and by long, I mean relative to the size of the layer. So let's take long horizontal connections, 2 cases, look at their colored, I color them according to layer, and now I see a strong organization by layer, right? Units in every layer now kind of try to clamp together, right? Because there is a lot of horizontal connections. Each layer is connected to a lot of layers from its own layer. Sorry, each unit is connected to a lot of units from its own layer. And you see this strong organization by layer. But now, if I look at the Visuotopic organization, I have multiple maps, right? This is one map. I'm going from yellow all the way to, you know, green. Again, you can think of it, oh, well, I have multiple maps, but these are non-biological maps, right? So when I actually forced each layer to correspond to a different visual map, it became non-biological. I didn't have any, you know, biological retinotopy. So then we can say, okay, then, oh, okay, maybe give you some intuitions, like full of intuitions, as much as I can. So what happens here is that as I tried to explain, is that, you know, you're having the cost. The cost is summing over all possible pairs of connections in the network. So you can think of like, the more lateral connections that you have, right, the higher the cost associated with, you know, with like separating this unit from the units connected to it, from the lateral connections. So the more lateral connections you have, in order to lower the cost, you have to bring them together, right? You have to start like bringing those units together. And bringing them together becomes more important than actually, bringing together units from other layers, because you have much less of them in terms of connections. So if I trivially just wrote the cost and thought of it as like a feed forward part, or like a cost coming from like in between layer connection and cost coming from horizontal or lateral connection, then that part is going to be ginormous now, because I made it this. And those units are going to just try to clamp together, and that's it. I want to lower the cost, so I'm just going to clamp together each layer. So how do we get something that looks more brain-like? So this is one idea, right? I'm taking you historically through how we thought about the problem. Well, we know that the brain, right, have this, as I said, maps which are repeating. We know that V1 is the largest area. It's the largest map, is V1. And then you have those thin stripes around it, which is like V2, and then a thin stripe, which is V3. So we said, okay, let's try something. Let's try to have horizontal connection and have the length of the horizontal connections vary by layer. And I have it vary, becoming less as we go up, because I just want to have the top layers have the ability in order to wrap around, the center layer without putting a lot of cost on having this wrapping happening. So I'm going to allow it to do this. And what I see if I do something like this, so we're going to look at a network here. Again, this is the 2x2 network that I previously showed you results of it, that forming one visual area. And again, I showed you results of it, how it can become non-biological. Now, when I vary the horizontal connections, I start to see like there is now a very obvious organization by layer, where your first layer kind of formed at the center, and then the second layer kind of wraps around it, and the third, and then the fourth. Again, because I did this gradients of horizontal connections. And when I look at the Visuotopic organization, now I can start seeing signature of multiple maps emerging. So I can think of this going from yellow, for example, to green one time as the first visual area. This will be like equivalent to V1, for example. Then I have another one around it that can be my V2, and another one. So I start to have a signature of biological retinotopy emerging. But if you notice, actually here, I think I should have put this line also here, is that it's not only the first layer contributing to your first area, but actually almost all your layers are contributing to your first area, right? And then other layers contribute to different areas. So you say, okay, other possible ways, for example, what happens if I make the middle layer to be the one with the longest lateral connections? Well, if I do this, now I'm putting a lot of cost on the second layer, or the middle of this. What I call the middle is the yellow layer, the second layer. Now, it cannot wrap around, right? There is a higher cost. There is a lot of cost if I take those yellow units and push them, put them on a ring. Because units which may be at the middle and at the quarter or half of that layer, they are connected together. But when I place them in a ring shape organization, there is a cost for them. I'm placing them away from each other. So we're going to also try to come to the center and get close to each other. And when I look at the Visuotopic organization, again, I see the signature of multiple visual maps emerging. So what I'm trying to say here is that you don't have to have only the first layer have the longest connections. It just, you have to have some layers have strong connections. These layers can come to the center because there is a high cost in separating them, because you have more horizontal to feed forward ratio. To think of horizontal in relationship to the layer size, in relationship to the feed forward, right, connection. And then wherever you put those large, you basically penalize those, you add a lot of horizontal connection in each layer, penalizing it a lot, to be kind of separate. It will try to clamp on and come to the center. So I don't want to, how can I say, I don't want to overshoot of what I've done, because it's like, there are so many ways to build a deep neural network, right? There is not only one way to build deep neural networks. And You can change the filter size, you can change the layers, you can change horizontal connections. Actually, I didn't show you for the sake of not complicating things up, but it also added channels where each layer has like, multiple channels. And I don't have to connect them. I can make them also feed forward as a regular component, or I can decide to connect them. And this does not change my results. But also you can change the stride. So the solution or the parameter space is huge. So what I tried to do is kind of just give maybe a rough schematic of that solution space. Again, I can't cover it, maybe just like recipes or ways in order to give biological like topographic organization. But what's mainly actually, or the take home message of this solution space we can think of is that if you just take a pure, so this is the same network, okay? This is the same network, and I'm just varying the horizontal connection basically in the different layers. So what I find is that if you just have pure feedforward networks, you have single area. As you start increasing the length of horizontal connections in each area, but you're still small compared to your layer sizes to your feedforward, you will still see, okay, I have now an organization by layer, like it's visually different from the intermixed layers, right? They're starting to trying to do something. But visuotopically, you're having still like if a map, a single map, but something is going on here. So then you move to region where you start, increasing horizontal connections in different layers, but allowing other layers to wrap around it by making less horizontal connections on the other layer, penalizing them basically less as they wrap around. And then you start to have basically a signature of biological maps emerging. But if you go to the extreme where now you make, well, every layer has a long horizontal connection compared to its feedforward, compared to its length, then you'll have what you want. Well, each, in the sense, if you want each layer in the network to correspond to a topographic area or to a brain area topographically, then you have it. But those retinotopies are non-biological. Okay. So what I say actually here, I repeat that there's actually a family of solutions with these motifs. So in summary, I can say that, well, what we've done here is that we created a cost function, and we took a network with a particular connectivity. We put them on the grid, and then we explored how different visual connectivity network map topographically under the minimum wire length hypothesis. We found that were three important factors: is your number of in-between layer connection, your lateral connection, and their relationship, or the lateral connection relationship to your layer size. So if I have to basically summarize all these things that might be confusing, as I've said, maybe this is the take-home message roughly is going to be, well, feed-forward hierarchical connections alone do not reveal separate hierarchical areas. So hierarchical connections do not immediately, give you separate hierarchical areas. We needed to add horizontal connections in order to reveal the hierarchy of visuotopic maps, and that the ratios between your horizontal feed-forward and the relationship to the layer size, all of them contribute to creating those brain-like organization or creating your maps. So what is the implication here? Well, the implication is that what we've done is that we created deep neural network. We know that deep neural networks, they don't have topography, but they do have a connectome, right? They are connected to each, they have connections, so they have a connectome. So under the constraints of minimum wiring, we can reveal the topography implied by this connectome, or by this connection, by these connections. And therefore, what we've done is that we made an approach, or a normative approach, that shows us how to map implicit topography of the deep neural networks And this hopefully will give us like some additional length into biological networks. So I hope I'm right on time. Thank you so much.